The single sheet of paper landed on Ethan Sterling's mahogany desk with the soft, dismissive flutter of a dead leaf. It was his advanced calculus midterm, and the grade, a perfect, vibrant 0 circled in the unforgiving red ink of his professor, seemed to mock the very air in the cavernous, sunlit classroom. Any other student at the Northwood Preparatory Academy would have been crushed, humiliated. Ethan simply smirked. He picked up the exam, not with the shame of a failure, but with the bored indifference of a king surveying a trivial offering from a lesser province. He crumpled the paper into a tight, satisfying ball in his fist, and, with a lazy, perfect arc, tossed it into the wastebasket by the teacher's desk. The gesture was a performance, a silent, arrogant declaration for the entire class to see. Your metrics do not apply to me. Your tests are irrelevant. Your world is not my own. His teacher, a man with a PhD, from Stanford, and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much wasted potential, simply sighed and looked away. As Ethan strode from the classroom, the hushed whispers of his classmates trailing in his wake, he moved with the easy, unbothered grace of a young prince in his own kingdom. He was 17, impossibly handsome, and the sole heir to a tech fortune so vast it was spoken of in the same tones reserved for the GDP of small nations. He did not walk through the hallowed, ivy-covered halls of Northwood. He owned them. He rounded a corner, his mind already on the new limited-edition sports car he planned to ask his father for, and nearly collided with a man who was, in the rigid, unspoken hierarchy of the academy, his polar opposite. The man was on his hands and knees, a bucket of soapy water beside him, meticulously scrubbing a small, stubborn scuff mark from the polished marble floor. He was older, in his 60s, a black man with a quiet, weathered face and the simple grey uniform of the school's janitorial staff. Ethan, without breaking stride, simply sidestepped him, his expensive leather shoes passing inches from the man's head. He did not see a person. He saw a function, an obstacle, a piece of the school's invisible machinery. But as he passed, the janitor, without looking up, spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, a sound that seemed to come from the very stone of the building itself. "You didn't fail the test, son," the man said, his words not directed at Ethan, but at the scuff mark he was erasing. "You just answered the wrong question." Ethan stopped, dead in his tracks. The words were so unexpected, so strange, so utterly out of place, that they pierced the thick, self-satisfied armor he wore like a second skin. He turned, a slow, incredulous pivot, to stare at the man who was still on his knees, a simple cleaning rag in his hand. For the first time in his young, arrogant life, Ethan Sterling was truly and completely at a loss for words. Ethan Sterling's world was a beautiful, sterile, and profoundly lonely place. It was a world of private jets that smelled of new leather, of sprawling, minimalist mansions where the art on the walls was worth more than the houses he flew over, of a life so insulated by wealth that it had lost all texture, all friction, all meaning. He was a boy who had everything and, therefore, valued nothing. The architect of this gilded cage was his father, Richard Sterling. Richard was a titan, a legend in the world of technology, a man who had built his empire, Sterling Industries, from a single brilliant idea into a global force. He was a man who had come from nothing, and he worshipped at the altar of strength, of will, of relentless, unforgiving ambition. He saw his son's casual, inherited privilege not as a gift, but as a dangerous, corrupting force. Their relationship was not a bond, it was a series of performance reviews. Dinners in their cavernous, silent dining room were not for connection, but for interrogation. "What did you accomplish today, Ethan?" Richard would ask, his eyes as cold and grey as a winter sky, scanning his son for any sign of the fire that had fueled his own ascent. And he always found his son wanting. He saw not a boy struggling to find his own identity in the shadow of a colossal father, but a lazy, arrogant, and deeply disappointing failure. He saw the failing grades, the dismissive attitude, the casual disregard for the very opportunities Richard had bled to create, and he saw it as a personal and unforgivable insult. The crack in Ethan's perfect, polished world was the profound and terrifying chasm that had opened between himself and his father. He wore his arrogance like a shield, his indifference a form of rebellion against a man whose approval he craved and knew he could never, ever earn. He failed his tests on purpose, a subconscious, self-destructive act of defiance. He sneered at his teachers because he knew that in the end, it was his father's name, not his own merit, that kept him enrolled in the hallowed halls of Northwood. He was a prince in a kingdom he despised, a prince who knew, on some deep, intuitive level, that he was not and would never be the king. That evening, the performance review was particularly brutal. Richard, having just received another scathing email from the school's headmaster, summoned Ethan to his study. He did not shout. He did not need to. His voice was a low, chilling instrument of pure, unadulterated disappointment. "The tutors have all quit," Richard said, his fingers steepled before him. "The teachers have given up. You are not just failing, Ethan. You are a void, a vacuum of potential." He then delivered his ultimatum. "You have one semester. One. If you do not, by the end of this year, demonstrate not just a passing, but an exceptional level of academic achievement, then you are done. The trust fund will be dissolved. The cars, the clothes, the entire pampered world you have taken for granted, it will all be gone. You will be on your own, with nothing but the name you have so spectacularly failed to live up to." The threat was absolute. It was not a plea for him to try harder. It was a formal and final declaration of his own impending exile. And as Ethan walked out of his father's study and into the long, silent and lonely corridors of his own home, he felt, for the first time in his young, privileged life, the cold, terrifying touch of genuine and inescapable fear. Mr. Samuel Jones was a man who understood the intricate, often invisible ecosystems of power. He had spent a lifetime studying them, first as a celebrated professor of mathematics and formal logic at MIT, and now, in his quiet, self-imposed exile, as a janitor at the Northwood Preparatory Academy. The change in station had not been a fall from grace, but a deliberate, monastic retreat from a world whose values he had come to despise. He was a ghost in the machine, a silent, humble presence who saw everything. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible hierarchies that governed the student body. He saw the quiet, desperate ambition in the eyes of the younger, untenured teachers. He saw the way the headmaster would bow and scrape in the presence of a wealthy parent like Richard Sterling. And he saw Ethan. He saw past the arrogant, cynical performance to the brilliant but lazy mind that lay beneath. He saw a boy who was not stupid but bored. A boy who was not a failure, but a prisoner, trapped in a cage of his own inherited privilege. He had seen boys like Ethan before, in the hallowed, ivy-covered halls of his former life. Boys with minds like race cars who had never been taught how to drive, who coasted on the fumes of their own natural talent until they inevitably, and often tragically, crashed. Samuel's own story was one of a quiet, profound, and heartbreaking loss. His wife, a brilliant and beloved historian, had died years ago, and with her, his own ambition had seemed to wither and die. He had retreated from the loud, competitive, and often soulless world of academia, seeking a simpler, quieter, and more honest life. He had taken the job as a janitor not because he had to, but because he wanted to. It was a life of simple, tangible problems that could be solved with a mop, a bucket, and a quiet, methodical, and deeply satisfying application of effort. But a mind like his could not be silenced. In the quiet pre-dawn hours before the first students arrived, he would sit in the empty school library, not with a novel, but with a book of complex, almost unsolvable mathematical proofs. He would work through the equations in his head, his mind a silent, humming engine of pure, abstract thought. Tucked into his work locker, beside his spare uniform and his worn, comfortable shoes, was a single framed photograph of his late wife, and beside it, a small, unassuming plaque. It was the Fields Medal, the highest and most prestigious award in the world of mathematics, an honor that was, in its quiet, almost monastic way, the equivalent of a Nobel Prize. It was a relic from a past life he had chosen to leave behind, a quiet, constant reminder of a world he had once commanded and had, in the end, willingly and peacefully abandoned. He was a silent and entirely contented king in a kingdom of his own, quiet and deliberate making. The fateful collision was not with Ethan, but about him. It was a quiet, almost civilized but deeply venomous encounter that revealed the true, hidden antagonists of his story. A week after Richard Sterling's ultimatum, Ethan's uncle, Walter Sterling, arrived at the Northwood campus. Walter was Richard's younger brother, a man who had lived his entire life in the shadow of his siblings' colossal success. He was a senior partner at a prestigious downtown law firm, a man of impeccable manners, expensive suits, and a quiet, almost serpentine charm. He came ostensibly as the concerned, loving uncle, there to consult with the school's headmaster about his nephew's troubling lack of progress. The meeting took place in the headmaster's opulent, wood-paneled office, a room designed to project an aura of old-world academic authority. Headmaster Thompson, a man whose spine seemed to dissolve in the presence of wealth, was at his most obsequious. "Walter, thank you for coming," he said, his voice a smooth, deferential purr. "We are all, of course, deeply concerned about Ethan. A boy with his potential should be thriving here." Walter sighed, a perfect theatrical gesture of familial concern. "I know, Charles. Richard is at his wit's end. He's a hard man, as you know. He doesn't understand subtleties. He only sees the bottom line, the failing grades. He doesn't see the boy's artistic temperament." The two men then proceeded to engage in a quiet and utterly damning conversation. They spoke of Ethan not as a student, but as a problem to be managed. They spoke of his lack of discipline, his rebellious streak, his unfortunate inheritance of his mother's more creative and less practical sensibilities. The collision was in the unspoken but perfectly understood subtext of their conversation. They were not trying to help Ethan. They were, in fact, colluding in his failure. Walter, with his quiet, insidious suggestions, was subtly and skillfully building a case against his own nephew, a case that would prove to his hard-nosed, unsentimental brother that Ethan was not a worthy heir, that he was a lost cause, a bad investment. A case that would, in the end, leave Walter himself as the only logical, stable, and competent choice to one day take the reins of the Sterling Empire. And Headmaster Thompson, a man whose school was the recipient of a very large and very consistent annual donation from Walter's side of the family, was his willing and silent accomplice. The final fateful moment of the collision came as Walter was leaving. He paused at the door of the headmaster's office, and this new, rather intense friendship he seems to have struck up with one of the janitors, Walter said, his voice a low, confidential whisper. It's concerning, Charles. It suggests a certain instability, a lack of judgment. We need to be careful that the boy isn't being unduly influenced. It was not a suggestion. It was a quiet and perfectly understood command. And as the headmaster nodded his solemn, sycophantic agreement, the true, hidden, and far more dangerous battle lines of Ethan's story were drawn. He was not just fighting against his father's expectations. He was fighting against a quiet and deeply personal conspiracy, a conspiracy that was designed not just to see him fail, but to ensure it. In the quiet, desperate hours after his father's ultimatum, Ethan had finally, and with a humility that was entirely foreign to him, sought out the old janitor. He had found him in the school's cavernous, silent gymnasium, sweeping the vast, polished floor. You said I was answering the wrong question," Ethan had stammered, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate in his mouth. "What did you mean?" Mr. Jones had not stopped his work. He had simply paused, leaned on his broom, and looked at the boy. "The question on your calculus test," he had said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "was not, 'What is the answer to this equation?' The question was, 'Do you have the discipline to learn the language of this equation?'" He had then gestured to the crumpled, failing test that Ethan was still clutching in his hand. "You have a brilliant mind, son, but it is a lazy mind. You are a king who has never been taught how to rule his own kingdom." This quiet, simple, and utterly devastating assessment was the first true lesson Ethan had ever received. And it had, in the days that followed, become the foundation of their strange, secret tutelage. Now, in the face of his uncle's insidious, veiled threats and the headmaster's quiet, complicit betrayal, Ethan did not retreat into his old, arrogant rebellion. He did something unconventional. He did what Mr. Jones had taught him to do. He started to ask the right questions. He did not go to his father. He did not confront his uncle. He went to the one place in the school that was a repository of its own, quiet and often overlooked history, the school archives, a dusty, forgotten room in the library's basement. He was not looking for a smoking gun. He was looking for a pattern. He spent an entire afternoon sifting through decades of old yearbooks, of alumni newsletters, of the minutes from old, forgotten Board of Trustees meetings. And he found it. It was not a single damning document. It was a series of small, almost insignificant details that, when viewed together, told a story. He found that his uncle, Walter, had been the chairman of the school's financial aid committee for the last 10 years. He found that the school's most generous and most consistent anonymous benefactor, the one who had funded the new science wing and the state-of-the-art athletic facility, was a foundation that was, in fact, a subsidiary of Walter's own law firm. And then he found the final and most chilling piece of the puzzle. He found the old, archived student files from 25 years ago. He found the file of a young, brilliant but financially struggling student who had been accepted to Northwood on a full academic scholarship. A student who had, in his junior year, been accused of a cheating scandal that he had vehemently but unsuccessfully denied. A student who had been quietly and unceremoniously expelled, his academic career in ruins. The student's name was Richard Sterling, his father. The seed of doubt was not a suspicion, it was a certainty. This was not a new conspiracy, it was an old one. His uncle, Walter, had not just been trying to discredit him, he had been reenacting a crime, a quiet and successful act of academic sabotage that he had committed against his own brother a quarter of a century ago. The battle for the Sterling Empire had not begun last week. It had begun here, in these very halls, a lifetime ago. At that moment, the arrogant princeling realized the janitor had not just taught him how to pass a test, he had taught him how to unearth a crime. If you believe that the truth is the one subject that can never be failed, give us a like to support Ethan's investigation and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Armed with a truth that was both a shield and a weapon, Ethan began his first real investigation. He was no longer a floundering student. He was a detective, and the hallowed, ivy-covered halls of Northwood were his crime scene. His lessons with Mr. Jones transformed. They were no longer about calculus or literature. They were about strategy, about the quiet, methodical art of gathering evidence. "A man like your uncle," Mr. Jones had advised him as they sat in the quiet, pre-dawn solitude of the school's boiler room, their new, secret classroom, "is a creature of habit. He has won this game before. He will assume he can win it again, using the same moves." Ethan's first move was to test that theory. He knew from his archival research that the key to his father's expulsion had been the testimony of a single and, in retrospect, highly suspect student witness. He needed to find out who was being positioned to play that role in his own modern-day reenactment. He started to watch, to listen. He used the social skills he had once employed for casual cruelty, now repurposing them for surveillance. He observed the intricate, almost invisible social hierarchies of the senior class, and he quickly identified his uncle's pawn. It was Mark Renshaw, a student who was, on the surface, Ethan's polar opposite. He was a scholarship student, a quiet, studious, and universally well-liked young man. He was also, Ethan discovered through a quiet and surprisingly revealing conversation with the school's bursar, the recipient of a special discretionary scholarship, a fund that was privately and anonymously administered by his uncle, Walter Sterling. Mark was not a villain. He was a victim, a good kid from a struggling family who had been trapped in a web of obligation, a pawn in a game he did not understand. Ethan's first investigation was not about finding a culprit. It was about understanding the mechanics of the crime. He saw now that his uncle's strategy was not one of brute force, but of quiet, insidious, and almost invisible manipulation. He was not just trying to make Ethan fail. He was building a careful and entirely false narrative of his own moral and academic collapse, a narrative that would be supported by the very systems and the very people the school was supposed to trust. And Ethan knew, with a new, cold, and deeply felt certainty, that to win this war, he would have to not just be smarter than his uncle, he would have to be more patient. As Ethan's investigation deepened, his curiosity about his strange, secret mentor grew. He knew Mr. Jones was a former professor, a man who had chosen a life of quiet, humble service. But he sensed there was a deeper story, a reason for his exile from the world of academia that was more profound than a simple desire for a quieter life. The secret was revealed not through a dramatic confession, but through a quiet, almost accidental discovery. One morning, As Ethan arrived for their pre-dawn lesson in the boiler room, he found Mr. Jones not with a book of mathematical proofs, but with a small, worn, leather-bound photo album. The old man was so lost in his memories that he did not hear Ethan enter. He was tracing a finger over a faded black-and-white photograph of a young, smiling woman with kind, intelligent eyes. "My wife, Eleanor," Mr. Jones said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur, thick with a grief that was still, even after all these years, a living thing. He then, for the first time, told Ethan his story. He spoke of his life at MIT, of the joy he had found in the clean, elegant, and predictable world of pure mathematics. He spoke of his wife, a brilliant and passionate social activist, who had dedicated her life to fighting for educational equity in the city's most underserved communities. And he spoke of the day his world had ended. Eleanor had been on her way to a protest, a demonstration against a new and deeply discriminatory piece of educational legislation. There had been a confrontation, a scuffle, and in the chaos she had been struck by a car, a hit and run, a crime that had, in the end, been ruled an unfortunate accident, its perpetrator never found. "I lost my faith," Mr. Jones said, his gaze distant, his voice a quiet and heartbreaking confession. "Not in God, but in the world. I had spent my life believing in the power of logic, of reason, of elegant, irrefutable proofs. But there was no logic in her death. There was no reason. There was only a senseless and unpunished act of violence." He had retreated from the world. He had resigned from his prestigious and now, in his mind, meaningless position at the university. He had taken the job at Northwood, a place that was the very antithesis of everything his wife had fought for, as a form of quiet, monastic penance. "I came here to be silent," he said, his eyes finally meeting Ethan's. "To watch, to remember. I did not intend to teach again." The hero's secret was not a story of a quiet, scholarly retreat. It was a story of a profound and unhealed wound. He was not just a janitor. He was a man in exile, a king who had, in his grief, abandoned his own kingdom. And Ethan understood, with a sudden and deeply felt clarity, that their strange, secret alliance was not just about him. It was about Mr. Jones as well. In teaching Ethan how to fight, the old, grieving professor was, in fact, beginning the slow and difficult work of healing himself. He was, in the most unexpected of ways, picking up the fallen standard of his wife's own unfinished battle. The revelation of Mr. Jones's past was a key, unlocking a new and far more sinister chamber in the mystery of Ethan's own life. The story of Eleanor Jones's death, of the unfortunate accident, of the unpunished crime, resonated with a terrible and familiar echo. "The legislation your wife was protesting," Ethan said, his voice a low and almost fearful whisper. "Do you remember what it was called?" Mr. Jones looked at him, a flicker of the old analytical fire returning to his eyes. "Of course," he said. "It was the Sterling Educational Opportunity Act." The trap, in its full, horrifying and generational scope, was finally revealed. The Sterling Educational Opportunity Act was not just a piece of legislation. It was the cornerstone of Richard Sterling's philanthropic legacy. It was a bill he had personally and very publicly championed. A bill that provided massive tax breaks for corporate sponsorship of private and charter schools. It was, on the surface, a testament to his commitment to education. But as Mr. Jones now explained, it was a lie. His wife, Eleanor, had discovered the truth. The act was a Trojan horse. It was a brilliantly designed piece of legislation that, under the guise of educational opportunity, would in fact divert millions of dollars of public funding away from the city's struggling public schools and into the coffers of a handful of elite and very profitable private academies. Academies like Northwood. And the primary and almost sole corporate sponsor who stood to benefit from this massive and entirely legal act of public theft was a newly formed and very powerful educational holding company. A company that was, in fact, a subsidiary of Sterling Industries. A company that was, at the time, being run by Richard Sterling's ambitious and utterly ruthless younger brother, Walter. The buried truth was a story of a crime that was not just academic, but civic. Walter Sterling had not just tried to ruin his brother's academic career 25 years ago. He had, with his brother Richard's passive and perhaps unknowing complicity, helped to pass a piece of legislation that had systematically starved the city's most vulnerable schools of the resources they needed to survive. And Eleanor Jones, the brilliant and courageous social activist, had been on the verge of exposing the entire, rotten and deeply corrupt scheme. Her death was not an accident, it was a silencing. The trap was not just a conspiracy to discredit Ethan, it was a generational war, a long and secret battle between two families, the Joneses and the Sterlings, a battle that had been fought in the quiet and often invisible arenas of legislative backrooms and academic committees. Ethan looked at the old, grieving man across from him, and he saw not just his teacher, but a fellow victim in a story that was far larger and far more tragic than he had ever imagined. His own personal and seemingly petty high school drama was, in fact, the final and most important battle in a 20-year war. Armed with the devastating truth of his family's long and secret war against the Joneses, Ethan was no longer a boy playing a game. He was a soldier, and his anger had been honed into a cold and deeply felt sense of righteous purpose. But as he and Mr. Jones began to strategize, to plan their own quiet and evidence-based counterattack, the villain of their story, sensing a shift in the currents of power, escalated his own insidious campaign. Walter Sterling, a man who had built his career on the art of the quiet and deniable threat, now moved to corner his nephew completely. He understood that Ethan's greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability was his relationship with his father, and so he moved to sever it. He paid a visit to his brother, Richard, at the sterile and imposing headquarters of Sterling Industries. He did not come with accusations. He came with a file, a thick and deeply disturbing dossier, a masterpiece of fabricated and decontextualized evidence. "Richard," he began, his voice a perfect and deeply practiced instrument of sorrowful concern, "I am afraid we have a problem with Ethan." He then laid out his case. He showed Richard the evidence of Ethan's obsession with the school's janitor, a man who was, he claimed, a disgraced and unstable former academic with a history of anti-corporate activism. He presented a series of carefully edited and deeply misleading security camera stills showing Ethan and Mr. Jones in quiet and, in Walter's framing, conspiratorial conversations in the school's basement. But his masterstroke was a single and beautifully forged document. It was a fake psychological evaluation, ostensibly from a concerned and anonymous school counselor. The report described Ethan as deeply alienated, paranoid, and highly susceptible to the influence of anti-authoritarian father figures. It suggested that his recent and dramatic academic turnaround was not a sign of genuine growth, but a symptom of a manic and deeply unstable psychological episode. "He is not just failing, Richard," Walter concluded, his voice a low and almost tearful whisper. "He is breaking. This janitor. He is poisoning him against you, against this family, against everything we have built." The villain's counterattack was not just an attempt to discredit Ethan, it was an attempt to have him declared mentally and emotionally incompetent. It was a move to strip him not just of his inheritance, but of his very agency, his voice, his sanity. And Richard Sterling, a man who was already predisposed to see his son as a failure, a man who was terrified by the recent and, in his mind, inexplicable changes in his son's character, was the perfect and most tragic of audiences. He did not see a lie. He saw a confirmation of his own deepest and most terrible fears. The trap was closing. The unexpected ally was not a person of power, but of proximity. She was a woman who had been a silent and almost invisible part of the Sterling family's life for over 30 years. She was their housekeeper, a quiet and deeply loyal woman named Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable was a woman who saw everything. She had been there during the quiet and, in retrospect, deeply suspicious aftermath of the cheating scandal that had ended Richard Sterling's own brief and promising academic career. She had been there during the hushed and often tense phone calls between Walter and Richard in the years that followed, and she had been a silent and heartbroken witness to the slow and painful estrangement between Richard and his own brilliant but deeply misunderstood son. She was not a spy. She was simply a woman who had, over a lifetime of service, become the keeper of the family's unspoken secrets, the silent and often only witness to its quiet and most profound tragedies. And she had been watching Walter. She had seen the way his quiet and seemingly benevolent concern for his nephew was always and without exception followed by a new and more painful rift between Ethan and his father. She did not know the details of his long and patient game, but she knew with the deep and unshakable intuition of a woman who had spent a lifetime observing the subtle and often invisible currents of a powerful family that Walter was not a friend. He was a poison. Her moment to act came in a quiet and almost accidental way. She had been in Richard Sterling's private study, a room she had been cleaning for 3 decades, and she had seen the file, the one Walter had left for his brother, the one with the forged psychological evaluation. She had not meant to read it, but a single and particularly cruel phrase had caught her eye. A pathological rejection of his own natural and inherited advantages. And in that moment, she had made a choice. She did not steal the file. She did not confront her employer. She did something far more subtle and far more powerful. She made a phone call. A call to the one person in the world she knew still carried a quiet and deeply felt torch for the lost and better version of the Sterling family. A person who had, in the years after Richard's own quiet and unjust expulsion from Northwood, been his one and only true friend. She called Mr. Jones. The unexpected ally was not just the housekeeper. It was the quiet and unbreakable bond of a long and almost forgotten friendship. Mrs. Gable, with her quiet and deeply courageous act of loyalty, had just handed Mr. Jones, and by extension Ethan, the one thing they had been missing: a witness from the inside, a quiet and unimpeachable voice that could testify not just to Walter's present-day manipulations, but to the long and deeply rooted history of his treachery. The board was no longer empty. A new and very powerful piece had just been quietly and decisively placed into play. The final and most devastating piece of evidence was not a document, but a memory. A memory that had been locked away in the quiet, and until now, completely silent, archives of Mrs. Gable's long and deeply loyal service. At a quiet and urgently arranged meeting in the back room of a small, unassuming neighborhood coffee shop, Mrs. Gable, her hands trembling but her voice steady, told Mr. Jones and Ethan a story. A story from 25 years ago. A story about a boy and a lie. "I was there," she began, her voice a low and almost confessional whisper. "The day they called Richard into the headmaster's office. The day they told him he was expelled." She recounted the scene with a painful and photographic clarity. She had been in the hallway, polishing the old grandfather clock, and she had heard everything. She had heard the headmaster's stern and deeply regretful voice. She had heard Richard's own youthful and desperate denials, and she had heard Walter's. "He was there," she said, her eyes meeting Ethan's, a deep and profound sorrow in their depths. "Your uncle. He was in the room. He was the one who had found the evidence." A cheat sheet, he had called it, in Richard's own familiar handwriting. She then revealed the final and most brutal piece of the puzzle. "But it wasn't Richard's handwriting," she said, her voice now a fierce and unwavering testament to a long-held and deeply painful truth. "It was Walter's. He was always so clever, your uncle. He could mimic anyone's handwriting, a little party trick he was so proud of. I had seen him do it 100 times. I knew his work, and I knew in that moment that he had forged it." The final piece of evidence was a quiet, and until now, completely unprovable act of fratricide. A quiet and brilliant act of academic murder, a crime that had not just ended a boy's future, but had, in its own quiet and insidious way, poisoned the very soul of the Sterling family for a quarter of a century. But Mrs. Gable had more than just a memory. She had proof. "I knew no one would believe me," she said, reaching into her old, worn handbag. "I was just the housekeeper, so I kept something, a piece of the story." She pulled out a small and carefully preserved piece of paper. It was a page torn from a notebook, a page of practice of a young man, a boy, perfecting the art of a crime. On it, in a series of repeating and increasingly accurate attempts, was a single and now spectacularly damning signature. Richard Sterling, written over and over in the unmistakable and now finally and irrevocably condemned hand of his own treacherous brother. The final piece of evidence was not a smoking gun. It was a quiet and deeply personal, and now, finally and triumphantly, resurrected act of witness. The stage for the final act was not a courtroom, but the cold and imposing boardroom of Sterling Industries. Richard Sterling, armed with the forged psychological evaluation from his brother and the anointing of the Northwood headmaster, had summoned Ethan for a final and what he believed would be a decisive family meeting. He was not there to listen. He was there to pronounce a sentence. He sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, a king in his own self-made kingdom. Walter sat at his right hand, his face a perfect and deeply practiced mask of sorrowful and reluctant concern. Ethan entered the room, but he was not alone. He was flanked on one side by the quiet and formidable presence of Mr. Samuel Jones, and on the other by the small and seemingly insignificant figure of Mrs. Gable. Richard looked at the strange and, in his mind, pathetic assembly, and his face hardened. "Ethan," he began, his voice a low and powerful instrument of command. "I have made a decision. You are a danger to yourself and to this family's name. You will be withdrawing from Northwood, and you will be enrolling in a therapeutic institution. It is not a negotiation. It is a final, and for your own good, and necessary act of parental love." The curtain had been raised on his final and most brutal performance, but it was not his play to command. Ethan did not speak. He simply looked at his father, his expression not one of fear or of anger, but of a quiet and deeply felt pity. He then looked at Mr. Jones, and Mr. Jones, the quiet and unassuming janitor, spoke. "Richard," he began, his voice a low and gravelly rumble that seemed to fill the silent and suddenly very small room. "Before you make a decision that you will spend the rest of your life regretting, I believe there is a witness who has something to say." He then gestured with a quiet and almost courtly grace to Mrs. Gable, and she, the quiet and for 30 years completely invisible housekeeper, stood. She did not speak of Ethan. She spoke of him, of Richard, of a day 25 years ago, of a boy and a lie. And as she spoke, as she laid out the quiet and devastating, and now finally and irrefutably true story of Walter's long and patient and deeply personal betrayal, Richard Sterling, the powerful and until now completely blind king, did not move. He simply sat and he listened. And as he listened, the entire and beautifully constructed and deeply and tragically false world that he had built around himself began piece by piece to crumble into dust. The curtain had at last, and in the most unexpected of ways, fallen. The collapse of Walter Sterling's world was not a dramatic, fiery explosion. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible implosion, a man consumed by the vacuum of his own, long-held, and now, finally and publicly exposed, lie. As Mrs. Gable's quiet and devastating testimony filled the silent and suddenly very cold boardroom, Walter did not protest. He did not deny. He simply sat, and a strange and almost imperceptible and deeply unsettling smile began to play on his lips. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a man who had been playing a long and difficult and deeply personal game, and had, in the final and most unexpected of moves, been checkmated. When she was finished, when she had laid the final and most damning piece of evidence, the small and carefully preserved piece of paper with his own youthful and now spectacularly incriminating handwriting on the polished and suddenly very empty table, he did not speak. He simply stood, and with a quiet and almost theatrical grace, he walked to the head of the table. He stood for a moment behind his brother's chair. He placed a hand, a gentle and almost loving hand, on Richard's shoulder. "You were always the brilliant one, Richard," he said, his voice a low and almost conversational whisper. "But you were never the smart one." And then he turned, and with a quiet and almost elegant finality, he walked out of the room, out of the building, and out of their lives forever. The justice was not a matter of a courtroom or of a prison. It was a quiet and deeply personal, and in the end, far more devastating form of exile. He was a man who had, in a single and final and spectacularly self-defeating act of hubris, been undone by the one and only thing he had never been able to control. The quiet and unshakable, and in the end profoundly and triumphantly true testimony of a woman who had simply been doing her job and telling the truth.